Good afternoon, everyone. You may be watching this in the morning. I'm not quite sure. We are doing this ahead of schedule. We have pre-recorded this, both Kyle and Amanda and the Ironwood team. They are going to be attending the Society for Human Resources annual training during our normal second Tuesday of the month. So we have taken time to prepare this ahead of time so we can send this out. I do know some of you may have questions off of what is discussed throughout this webinar. And if you do, feel free to shoot me an email and I would be more than happy to get those questions over to Kyle and Amanda for them to answer those upon their return. So, and if you do have any issues, if you have signed up for Ironwood and an issue does arise, don't worry. There is going to be someone within the office taking those calls. And if there are an emergency, someone will make sure that you are attended to while they are at this conference. But I am going to hand things over to Amanda. She's going to start us off with the FLSA overtime rules. I know there's been lots of questions regarding this, and we thought this would be something of value to bring to the table. So Amanda, I'm going to hand things over to you, and we appreciate you being here with us.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yes, as Elizabeth mentioned, this is actually one of the topics we've gotten a lot of questions on. I actually think every topic that we're doing today came from either an NCW or Sanford and Tatum, more than one person. So that's great. And it was reflective of all the calls that we're getting. But in thinking about, as Elizabeth mentioned, FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, I won't get that right again, so I'm not going to say it again either. A few months ago, we touched very high level that there might be some overtime changes coming. But at that point, it was in the far off future, and we just, bullet pointed a few quick things. But we still don't have the official rule yet, but we were expecting it in April or May. So it could be between now and the next week. And we would update this in the interim if that came up. But at any moment now, we could get the actual overtime rules and proposals in. So to cover that, we wanted to kind of backtrack just a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about exemptions. That's not the focus, but I want to cover it high level and what the proposed rules are. And then we're going to really highlight the 10 things that most often are rule violations, what the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division comes in and audits and fines employers for. So those are going to be our key things to look for. And then, of course, if you ever have specific questions or are going through a specific job analysis, we're here to help with that. But if we start off with remembering that when I use these terms, exempt and non-exempt, the exempt employee is the person exempt from overtime. So that is traditionally those employees that you're paying via salary, whereas your non-exempt or not exempt from the overtime rule are those that are hourly and would be eligible for overtime if they worked either more than 40 hours a week, or there's some few one-offs there if it's a per diem or per job that we won't dive into specifically today, but again, we can always walk through those processes individually or maybe in another session if it comes up. So in deciding whether a job is exempt or non-exempt and whether or not you have to pay them overtime, the first thing that you have to look at is the overall salary. And as I mentioned a few months ago, this changed back in 2020. It was the first time it had changed in many years, but it moved up to $684 a week, which is about $35,000. So you have to be paying this person at least that much for them to be eligible to be exempt. So that's step one. So if they are making more than that $684 a week, so then you'd move on to, okay, but do the tasks they perform really warrant an exemption? And those are broken down into the executive category. So think your C-suite, your division and department leaders, those people where management and day-to-day operations are their day-to-day jobs. There's the administrative exemption, which the wording's a little tricky there because it's not like admins or administrative assistants. It's just those other, maybe non-executives, but managers, people who have the discretion to make big decisions and really control a department or have maybe it's something like a spending budget. They are just working in the office is why they call it administrative. Then there's also a professional creative. So that's someone that either had to have an advanced degree to go into their field, or something like a computer professional where they have to, have certifications and be trained in the application of computers. And then sales has a whole different set of exemptions there based upon your based upon your compensation package and your bonuses structure, but those could also be exempt under some of those. So if you decided that the role that you're trying to determine falls under one of those categories, your last step would be really looking at the job analysis. What is this person actually doing? What are the minimum qualifications? What does the job description say? Does that job description reflect what this person is really doing? That's where we get more hung up. Is this correct? And you were checking obviously with that individual and their manager. Is this reflected on your org chart and known throughout the organization? Does your performance reviews document these duties and responsibilities? So it's trying to weed out whether or not you're really performing at this exempt level versus maybe just having it listed on your job description, but really there's a manager or higher level person making the decisions. And just in the news this last week, so here at the beginning of June, there was a huge case out of Oklahoma where Frontier Energy Solutions, so oilfield pipeline, was fined $3.8 million for overtime violations. And that was just a very real example that we talk abstractly a lot of times about you could get fined, or this is what might happen, you could get sued, this could happen. But that was just a very relevant example, and we're hearing things like that all of the time. We mentioned a few months ago, Department of Labor has staffed up this year, so there are now more investigators. But moving on to what the top mistakes are. So we've got that information in our head about whether or not they're exempt or not. We're thinking through that. But what could go wrong? One of the key mistakes that employers often make is they try to average out the weeks. So let's say you're looking at a 4-week time period, and then instead of looking at your defined work week, which your company defines, it could be Monday to Sunday, it could be Wednesday to Tuesday. It is defined and laid out by individual companies as long as that's communicated. Is that more than 40 hours versus, okay, well, it was 32 hours this week and then 40 and then 48. Well, and the next one maybe was 38 again. That equals less than 40 overall, so we don't have to pay overtime. No, it's very specific here in Texas that over 40 hours equals overtime. And you do have to be aware there, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but some state laws are a bit different. Mostly for the areas where we're talking today, you're going to look at that 40-hour work week, but it's always a good idea to check and make sure your state doesn't have any other regulations. The second most common mistake that's listed from the Department of Labor, and probably what we get calls on the most, is when employees are not paid the overtime because it wasn't previously approved. So they've come in, they didn't ask their manager if they could finish up their job and work an extra hour. And then when you're looking at payroll and time cards, you say, oh, well, we're not going to pay you for that hour at overtime because we didn't tell you to work it. Unfortunately, that is not the way that these regulations work. You have to still pay them for any work performed beyond 40 hours. But that would be a disciplinary situation. You still can talk to the employee and remind them of the policy and what the protocol is and what they should do next time, but you can't actually withhold pay. And then in the same vein, undercounting the hours that are worked. A big thing we run into with hourly non-exempt employees is everyone having email on their phone or taking work calls after hours or text messages after hours. Really diligent employees saying, oh, I'm just going to clock out and finish this up. Unfortunately, none of that means they shouldn't be paid for that time. And even if they volunteer for it, they should be paid for that time. So if you hear those types of phrases, that should trigger you to remind them to stay clocked in, talk to their supervisor. You know, if they're overwhelmed with work or getting everything done within their job duties, you know, that needs to be another conversation, whether it be to look at further training or distribution of labor. But anything that's anytime they are working should be counted towards their pay. Another thing that happens is they miscalculate meal periods. So although breaks are not required here in Texas, a lot of employers offer after 4 hours, you can have a 20-minute break, or within an 8-hour shift, you can have a 30-minute break. It's important to know that if the break is less than 20 minutes, that is time that should be compensated, because that is those breaks running to the bathroom, running to grab a quick snack out of the vending machine, but you coming right back to work. It's things like that. It's that quick break. And that meal periods, lunch breaks are really 30 minutes or more. And it has to be uninterrupted time. Your receptionist can't clock out, go grab her sandwich and come back to the desk and eat and keep working. That's still considered work time that he or she should be paid for. The sixth one is what I mentioned before, neglecting state law. So just making sure that if you operate or have employees in other states, that you're double checking that it's the same as these regulations. There's only a few that look at 8 hours a day or more, but that is something that is law in a few states. Again, as I mentioned, I jump ahead a lot. Thinking that an employee can waive their right is another mistake. So even if they volunteer, you are expected to pay them. And it is on the employer to know whether or not they're working. So you can't even just plea, I didn't know they were working. Well, you need to have protocols and procedures in place for what they should do if they're overworked or if they receive a work call after hour, how to record that time or how to direct that elsewhere. Giving employees paid time off instead of overtime pay is one we hear about a lot. This isn't a compensation method for non-exempt employees. In fact, if you are a privately owned company, comp time isn't really a pay practice you should be using on a regular basis, and especially not for non-exempt employees. You can't trade off. They are entitled to time and a half for over 40 hours of work. Again, either requiring or allowing off the clock work. Again, the onus is on you to make sure that that's not happening. You have protocols and procedures in place. And then the last one, which you guys may not see a ton, but I have gotten a call on it before, is improperly applying the overtime regulations to fluctuating work weeks. So there are some jobs that are designed either on a fluctuating work week schedule, but that's very clearly defined, and there are lots of rules and regulations there. So don't get any ideas here. We need to talk that over. But it also could be things like if a bonus was given over the month, depending on whether it was discretionary or non-discretionary, that might actually affect the standard rate of pay that hourly employee should have received, even if the time has already passed. So you could have to go back, and if the bonus was for over a month period of time, let's say it was for May, and they didn't get the bonus till May 31st, you would still have to go back in some situations and reconfigure whether or not that would change the rate of pay for all of those weeks during May. And so then just to touch on what they are proposing, the change is that instead of that $35,000 salary rule, we don't know the exact number that the proposal is going to come out with for the salary. We've heard wild speculation about 70, 80,000. Realistically, that's not expected, just because that's what they tried in 2016 and then in 2020. And there's no way that is realistically going to stick. So insiders and people that follow these things are guessing that the proposed salary exemption level would come in at about $48,000, $49,000 per year. Again, we're not sure. Something could come out. I would expect this to go back and forth, and us to probably come out with some sort of compromise. But as you're thinking about these things, 48, 49,000 is where I would start to look at anyone that possibly falls between that 35 and 48 range that you may need to look at their exemptions again. And the salary does seem to be the big focus for this proposed change. There could be some changes to those exemptions. So whether that be the definition of the executive, administrative, professional, sales, creative, computer exemptions, we could see some changes, to the subpoints and bullet points as to what really meets those expectations. But we just don't know yet what that's going to look like. But the salary threshold is really what we have as the best thing we can guesstimate might happen. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Department of Labor has hired more and more wage and hour investigators, and key areas that they are targeting is those misclassification of workers. It was very high in COVID to list employees as contractors instead of employees. So they're looking at those misclassifications, which then they could go back and those people could be entitled to back pay and overtime. And then those areas that are just traditionally more low wage employees or have a lot of violations. So construction, food services, retail, those sorts of things. And then the last point to remember is that these investigations, they are taking both for civil penalties and liquidated damages. And in some situations, not only the employer can be subject to the penalties, but managers and supervisors could also be subject to those penalties. That's really kind of specific to the restaurant industry with the managers and individuals, but it's something to keep in mind, and it's something that could come through on this proposed changes. So that wraps up some of the top overtime mistakes and what we're expecting to come out anytime now about proposed overtime changes. And as we have more information, we'll share that. But for the moment, I'm going to jump over to Kyle, and she is going to move on to our next topic.
Thank you, Amanda. I am going to start my first topic as leveraging your leadership style. So when it comes to leveraging your leadership style, there isn't one perfect style that's going to fit all. Not all organizations thrive under the same type of leadership. So it's great that we have so many styles to pick from. The best leadership style can greatly depend on the person, the organization as a whole, the industry, and what the organization might just need at that moment in time. So just the very basics. What is leadership? I know we've heard the term constantly, and there's plenty of definitions, but the basic definition of leadership is the person or the team tasked with setting the direction, inspiring the vision, and mapping out how they best achieve that vision. A good leader encourages the team to perform at their optimum level. My favorite leadership quote that I've ever personally read is, a leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. The different factors that might affect your personal leadership style can vary depending on the task, the tradition of the organization, the type of labor force, your personality, the time. I mean, we had to change up leadership styles during COVID, and definitely different times that a business might need a different kind of leadership style to better achieve the goal at the moment. And even your gender can sometimes affect your leadership style. I'm going to highlight a few of these styles, but it's by no means an exhaustive list. If you haven't ever explored your own leadership style and what it might be, hopefully you can recognize it in some of the examples I'll discuss right now. So one of the more familiar styles is autocratic leadership. The main keyword I would use to describe it would be control. So this is the style when a boss typically makes the decisions and they do not necessarily consider employee input. If this is your leadership style, a lot of the advantages would be a highly productive team and helpful with quick decision making. Some of the disadvantages might be less motivated team. They might be productive, but not necessarily motivated all the time because they are so productive and can experience burnout. It can also create a them versus us mentality between leadership and employees, and it can hurt the employee morale and engagement can suffer. But this is best used if there is an urgent need or crisis because it can help foster that quick decision making. I think the next most familiar style would be democratic leadership, and the key word I use there is participative. This is where leaders ask for input and decision making is shared between leadership and employees and everyone at the organization. So some advantages to this style would be your employees feeling very valued, less turnover, and it helps to make complex decisions because you can pull from so many different specialties and experiences. Some of the disadvantages can include, it can result in more mistakes. You're trying new things and having a bunch of different ideas, so it could result in a couple more errors along the way. It does require more highly trained and skilled employees. And again, employee morale engagement can suffer. But this is best when you need to really foster that team work mentality if you're operating in all different kinds of styles and you just need to bring everyone together. Another style would be coaching. The key word I use here is motivational. It focuses on developing the people around you. An advantage would be helping identify high potential employees. It empowers individuals and it can increase individual employee performance. Some of the disadvantages, it does require a lot of time and patience from the leader. So they will have to have a very patient, understanding way of leading. And it is required for equal commitment to be needed from both the leader and the team for the style to succeed. Not surprisingly, this is best used in coaching like a sports team. The next most familiar is probably laissez-faire leadership. The keyword I use here is hands-off. So this allows group members to make decisions and relies on trust rather than micromanagement. The style works very well with creative workers or software developers. It encourages professional and personal growth, and it fosters innovation and creativity. Some of the disadvantages could be issues with productivity, some confusion and lack of accountability, and can be more isolating than some of the other styles. Again, best used for those creative workers that need those big blocks of time, and deadlines exist, but you can't sit on someone's shoulder and tell them to write a whole book. The same way you can say, hi, I need this expense report by call of business. So those would be the situations where this would best, where laissez-faire leadership style would be best used. I think the last example I have, and again, not exhaustive, is servant leadership. This would be people first leadership. The leader acts as like a protector of their team. The term mama bear, papa bear kind of leadership is how I would describe it. This has high level of trust between employees and leadership. It aligns personal and professional goals, and it helps decrease turnover. Some of the disadvantages might be, again, time, like coaching, time consuming. Servant leaderships can sometimes be perceived as weak and potentially lose respect, and it has slower decision-making capability. This happens to be my leadership style, so I know it well. I really, really like being that go-to person for people I work with, and it helps really foster that teamwork and helping I need from a career, but I can attest to the fact that it can be tiring. It can increase burnout, and you can become very, very attached to the people you work with. And so I always try to be that go-to person, but because I could sometimes coddle, I wasn't always the go-to person for when things needed to get done immediately. If you needed, a pat on the back, I was your person, but I might not be able to get things done immediately if they need to be done. So we all have our roles. Different people thrive under different kinds of leadership. Having a leadership team comprised of different styles to adapt to different needs is the ultimate goal. If you have a leadership style comprised, or a leadership team comprised of these different styles, I know it sounds simple, but the best thing to do is let the styles do what they're good at. Leadership development is always important, and helping people grow their skills should be a priority. But in the end, letting people play to their strengths will result in the most success. I'm going to use the example I know, and it happens to be restaurant management. But we had a front of house team and we had a back of house team, and I was always more the front of house kind of leader, in charge of like servers, as example, and it worked well with servant leadership. But I could anticipate their needs. They might need a little bit more guidance. Sometimes it's the first job they've ever had, so they need a little bit more coddling, a little bit more training, and almost someone, almost like that mama bear sometimes, especially when they're 16, 17-year-olds embarking on their first job. It was really helpful when they needed a morale boost, because you can be like a cheerleader, and a lot of times that is what front of house needs to have that engagement with the clients or the guests. Back of house, not so much the same. They needed it was probably predominantly male typically. So they usually worked best with a more authoritative or even coaching style of leadership. I could, make them smile, get them drinks, and, give them a little laugh, but they worked best when they were given those clear-cut instructions, and they had, they just really they really fostered their growth and just in their growth and just their production when they have those more lined out rules and procedures in front of them. So I wasn't always the best to deliver that. That was more of our bigger, intimidating, tough guy manager that we had, and they always did better under those kinds of circumstances. But each organization is different, of course. The best way to lead your team is find out what your employees need from a leader, and it could be individual differences to help them succeed. So ways to do that could be just simply asking what qualities their best boss might have or their worst boss might have, or how can you tell when they're stressed, so you can help obviously de-stress them. And maybe different leadership styles have different ways to do that and would work better with individuals. It's always good to try and take time to learn and research your own style to see what it might be, and it can help greatly reduce stress, burnout, grow your leadership capital, and overall job satisfaction. That is what I have on leadership styles, and I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda for the next topic.
Thanks, Kyle. We're ping-ponging a bit today. I apologize. With the allergies, I was afraid my voice would go out. So if you hear some cracking, that's what's happening here. I bet some of you can relate. So from here, we are going to talk about drug testing considerations, especially right now with the labor market. It's always a relevant topic, but we want to keep in mind a few of these other considerations as well. So to tackle this, we're going to come at it from a couple of different angles. I mean, we are going to talk about the current labor market, but from there, we can talk about things you might want to think about when considering whether or not you want to have a drug and alcohol policy, or how you would enforce that, what that would look like. So we'll work through that. I am speaking generally today about employees that work for private employers. These are general employees, so these are not those individuals that are suspect to DOT regulations. And if either you work for a federal contractor or have a federal contract, this could be different for you as well. So just keep that in mind, that there is an asterisk and there can be some exceptions. But as probably many of you are aware, we are seeing the highest number of positive drug tests that we have seen in the last 20 years. They are testing approximately 20 million employees yearly for pre-employment drug tests. So this is something that's happening every day all over. And in the last 5 years alone, so since 2017, those positive drug tests are 12% higher than even they were 5 years ago. That's probably not incredibly surprising to many of us. If you looked over the political landscape in the last 5 years, a lot more states have passed different measures to legalize some degree of marijuana. And not that this statistic didn't include other drugs, but statistically, that's the substance that comes back positive the most often, and is generally the one that many of us are thinking about when we're really trying to consider whether or not we're going to have a drug testing policy. And it even feels a little foreign to even think about whether you should or should not. I feel like as an HR professional, you know, even 3, 4, 5 years ago, goodness, maybe even a year ago, I would have been 100% no. Really, the way to go is to drug test. You want to know what you're dealing with before an employee comes on board. You know, we want to know whether or not there's an issue or not that could affect their work, you know, prior to the problem happening. And although that rings true definitely in situations of safety issues, there are definitely roles and responsibilities where I'd 100% give the same advice. What we're seeing a lot more of, and what I imagine you guys are hearing and seeing as well, is either employers foregoing the drug testing altogether just because they are not finding qualified applicants. Again, we are all aware that the labor shortage has been intense over the last couple of years, and you know, it's not showing signs yet of letting up. And so the thought there is, if you go ahead and not exclude these individuals, you might have a better success rate at hiring and retaining employees. And in fact, there's even been some major United States employers that had advertised that we don't drug test anymore, which again is not something that you would have necessarily thought of a few years ago. But again, they're doing it for recruiting and for hiring. What was interesting when I was looking at some of this information, and that we have to start thinking about as well when you're deciding whether or not you are going to have a drug policy or not, or pre-employment testing, is it's estimated that 60% of Americans that use some sort of substance, illegal substance, are working currently. So when you're thinking, well, I know my employees, this wouldn't happen to us, this couldn't happen to us, I'd be able to tell. You need to consider that people, whether it's an addiction-based or a medical issue or just unsafe because of prescription and they didn't notify a supervisor, 60% of those people are out there working. With that, you have to consider, if you are going to have a drug testing policy, that addiction is now recognized in some form or fashion under both the American with Disabilities Act, and that includes everything from opioids down to marijuana. There's a very specific definition as what addiction is and what treatment is. But it could be considered treatment, it could be considered that they have protected coverage under the ADA if they can show that they had addiction and that they need an opportunity to have unpaid leave, to have an ADA accommodation to allow them to recover. That is newer, and I don't want that to put anyone into a panic. Especially even the mention of opioids falling under the ADA is relatively new. And when we see new coverage like that, there isn't the opportunity for those interpretations to be tested yet. So we don't have a lot of examples that I can point to specifically that say, this employer was punished for terminating an employee, XYZ. But keeping that in mind, that because mental health is considered classified as a psychological disorder, that you might have to really reframe your thinking that addiction is like any other medical diagnosis. And in fact, there is a Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act that applies to ensure that you are remembering that mental health is health and how you apply that to your organization. So if you were going to have a drug policy, or maybe you already have one and you're thinking about freshening it up or revising it, or just really trying to consider whether it's worth it or not for recruiting and hiring purposes, really the best practice ideals are to offer an array of options if an addiction comes up. So whether that be being very vocal and upfront about we make ADA accommodations, which again might be unpaid time off. If you have a substance abuse program that you follow as an employer, making sure that people are well aware of that. Again, that has its own rules and regulations on its side that you would need to set up. Whether you as an employer have an EAP that you pay for as one of your benefits to employers. I feel like that's one of the most underutilized benefits that companies will pay for, because it's great. You can sometimes get several free sessions. You can get referrals to all sorts of different professionals, including mental health professionals. But a lot of times employees just don't either know that it's available or understand that it could be multiple sessions at cost or at no cost to the employee. Or they're concerned about privacy considerations that, if they call and say, I want treatment for depression, that will be disclosed back to the employer. And it's really not that sort of relationship. It's just a benefit for the employee. So making sure that you have an array of options if an addiction or a substance abuse or misuse option comes up, making sure that there's easy access. So all of those options that we just talked about, how is your employees going to find out about it? What works for your business? So that could be whether if you're mostly virtual or in the field, making sure those are in your organization's cloud or on your drive, or if individuals all work in the office, making sure those posters and resources and phone numbers are available or handed to new employees, but making sure that it is readily and regularly distributed to employees and that it's encouraged as something that you value and want them to utilize. You want to really encourage your leaders to take charge. This can't just be a singular HR initiative that when something comes up, it just gets pushed or referred to who's ever handling your HR responsibilities. We need our managers, our executives, our leaders to understand these issues and considerations and really be involved in that decision-making process of what this would look like whether or not you went with drug testing or not, or whether or not you enforced a zero tolerance policy or not. You really need multiple opinions and considerations, and for people to be aware of it if you do move forward with something. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you are protecting privacy and confidentiality of the employee. I just said make sure you have all of the stakeholders involved, but of course that doesn't mean that they are all getting the results of an individual employee's drug test. We want to make sure that that is very controlled, and that that information and what to do when that information comes back goes to a point person or a point department, and that that's contained to only necessary parties that need that information. So in general, under Texas and federal laws, there aren't specific limitations to you setting your own drug and alcohol policies. But again, you really have to focus on, if we're setting this rule or procedure, is it laid out and defined? Because so often we get calls and we have conversations, or we're looking at an employer's policy and working with you on that, and they convey to us, well, we really want it left on a case-by-case basis. 10 out of 10 times we're going to point out to you that that case-by-case basis really opens you up to the liability of discrimination, because so many inferences and differences could draw back to whether one person was allowed to violate the policy, or whether one person was given a second chance or given treatment options and another wasn't. We need to lay out the what ifs beforehand. So what, as an organization, do we consider a violation? Which employees are going to be covered under this policy? Because it is possible that you designate, your safety sensitive position. So only your forklift drivers, only your drivers, only people in those roles are going to be tested, not the administrative workers. And that's fine. You just have to be consistent. You have to have it laid out beforehand, not a spur of the moment decision, and it be a policy, process, and procedure that you consistently follow. Again, you want to lay out and think through what will be your disciplinary measures if there is a violation. Don't wait until it comes up to think about what should happen next. And then whether or not, as a company, you're going to allow some sort of rehabilitation. Now, again, that may link back to some of those ADA considerations that I just did an overview of. But what is your goal as a company? It's good to have a vision of that even before you would go back and make sure that it falls within all of the other legal regulations. But then, of course, if you do come up with a policy, that would need to be distributed to all of your employees in writing so they can ask questions. Of course, you want a written acknowledgement, and you want to receive a copy of that. That could be in the handbook itself, and it could be separate, especially we see it a lot if it is maybe only particular roles are tested. You might see it separate from the handbook. But in general, I generally recommend including it if possible in the handbook so everyone is aware of it. But remembering that it is possible to set separate processes and procedures for different groups. But again, consistency is the key, and laying things out before a problem arises. You want to think through everything that could go wrong. What if they pop as positive? What if they refuse to test? You've got to think through all of these scenarios, for the years to come if you were to expand rapidly, because who you have working for you and the employees you know and trust now may not be who's there in a year, 5 years. And you can have both, whether it be conditional offer, pre-employment drug testing, and random for cause testing. Again, just have to spell out the policy and procedures. If you are going to do random drug tests, what does that look like? You can't just say random, there has to be a plan. 2 employees are going to be tested each week, depending on the size of the company, and they will be randomly drawn by a third party. Or something along that line. Every quarter we'll test 5 random employees, but no employee will be tested more than twice a year. These are just examples, but you've got to have that laid out. You can't just say that it's random and then really maybe not be as random as you think you're being. And again, it's really important that everyone from the executive leadership, president, CEO, owner of the company, down to your frontline supervisors understand what the policy is, so that as much as possible, we are avoiding any ADA issues, any equal opportunity discrimination issues, so that we are very clear on what the expectations are and what we would do moving forward. And then, as most of you guys are aware, and we won't go too far down the workers' comp or after an incident or accident, but of course you could have a separate either component of your policy or policy for those situations as well, because so often that's just standard practice. Again, we're talking about general employees here, not DOT or any specialized employees as far as what post-accident procedures would be. You want to make sure you have a lab source already identified, pointed out. Don't wait until you have an accident to then set up a agreement with a lab. You know, over that time, depending on what you're testing for, that could work out of the system. It could be, you know, days or weeks to come to an agreement and have all of the paperwork filed. So again, have that set up before you put the policy in motion. And then again, focus on confidentiality of the results. You know, sometimes you have listed in the policy, you know, if you were to be prescribed a medication that could affect your job, you need to disclose that to your supervisor. Thinking through what that looks like, or is it the supervisor they disclose to? And it is really important to remember, if you do go with a drug policy, that this could be the key documentation in an unemployment claim. What they are looking for historically in Texas unemployment claims to prove that drug tests constitute misconduct is there has to be a policy in place prohibiting the positive drug test. You have to have evidence that they consented to the drug test. You have to have clear documentation of chain of custody for the actual sample, which is a lot of times why organizations go with a third-party contractor. You also have to have very specific types of testing. The initial test has to be, I'm not even going to pretend to pronounce what this exact type of methodology is, but there are certain regulations for the type of testing that is done. And even just being aware that sometimes the initial urine test, once it's processed onto the lab, it might be a tentative answer that you get initially, and then they let you know it'll be a day or two before you have the answers. But then you also need that documentation of that positive test. So that is really what you would need in addition to the policy and procedure to show that it was misconduct and warranted. So I know that was a lot of information to consider and a lot of what ifs that we just touched on at a high level. But that's the things you really need to be thinking through when you consider, you know, is it worth it to go without a drug policy or with a drug policy, or somewhere in between where, you know, you're allowing something to some degree or the employees have options. So, of course, if you have questions about that, you can always reach out to us. We're happy to help. So with that, I'm going back to Kyle, and she's going to talk a bit about workplace violence.
Thanks, Amanda. So our final topic is workplace violence considerations. Each year, 2 million US workers report having been a victim of violence at work. So workplace violence can be considered any act of threat or physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behaviors that occur at the work site. It doesn't just involve employees, it can involve clients, customers, and visitors. And workplace bullying also falls under workplace violence. It can even include domestic violence that might spill over into the workplace from outside parties that have relationships with employees. Some of the factors that can increase the risk of violence would be jobs that include exchanging money with the public, working alone or in isolated areas or high crime areas, providing care to individuals like healthcare setting, anywhere alcohol is served, and even the time of day. So, night shift versus day shift. Just some risk factors to consider. High risk workers include delivery drivers, taxi drivers are the most discussed occupation in all the resources I've looked at about the high risk for taxi drivers and workplace violence. Healthcare professionals, public service workers, customer service agents, and law enforcement are other high risk workers. So how to prepare for workplace violence? There's a few things that you can do to help prepare. Identify the type of violence, and I'll go into that in just a second. Create a violence prevention plan. Consider your insurance needs, know any possible warning signs, and recognize risky situations, and always encourage reporting. And I'll go into each one in a little bit of detail. So identifying the types of violence. To develop prevention strategies, you should first consider the different types of workplace violence and then tailor the different strategies to each one. So the four main ones would be criminal intent. That is someone coming in trying to, it's like a bank robbery. Customer to client, that would just be an interaction between a customer and an employee. Coworker, obviously, to employees, and a personal relationship. So that would go back to the domestic violence from the last couple we talked about. So in terms of creating prevention strategies for criminal intent, a couple controls you can put into place would be like cash control, where the money's stored, and just different prevention strategies on how to handle if someone comes in trying to get cash from the safe, for example. Lighting control, entry and exit control, and surveillance. So installing cameras and additional signage. It could also review the hours of operations and precautions when it comes to opening and closing the business. Fostering a good relationship with police would be a prevention strategy. Training all employees on robbery response and the safety equipment, or how to deal with aggressive, drunk, or otherwise problem persons. The next one would be like customer client violence prevention. So that includes having adequate staffing and a different skill mix. And then training to the specific customer client violence. So recognizing those behavioral cues, de-escalation, interpersonal communication, and sometimes proper restraint and takedown techniques for healthcare staff, as an example. The third type of violence would be worker on worker prevention. So during the hiring process, that could mean conducting background screens or checking the former employee references. Also training in the policies and procedures of reporting. So utilizing your new hire orientation and always including refresher training, no matter how long anyone has been there. The fourth type would be that personal relationship violence prevention. Again, training in policies and reporting, identifying coworkers, helping coworkers identify the different traits and cues, even though it can be a very touchy subject that you have to be very careful around, and just fostering a culture of support. So no penalties for coming forward, promising confidentiality, different safety and security protocols, and community service referrals offered. The easier the access, the more easy it is to get help. So in terms of creating a prevention plan, you will always need management commitment and employee participation for success. So that's using all the opinions and perspectives to identify the hazards and eliminate the risks. You should also conduct a worksite analysis. So that means going throughout the worksite, conducting a needs analysis and inspection of the workplace to find potential or existing risks. Hazard and prevention control would be the next step. So that would be making sure the lighting is appropriate, installing panic buttons. Are the doors and locks all secure? Maybe you need sign-in sheets to help identify who comes and goes. In terms of panic buttons, I found them very, very helpful in my past management. You can hide them throughout the throughout the building, and they can alert your local police department. And the promise was that they would be there in 30 seconds. And we had a couple accidental hits of those buttons, but they were there in 30 seconds. So that was just a really nice thing to know that those were options. Also having safety and health trainings and making sure everyone knows the protocols. Panic buttons were great, but when we realized not everyone knew about them, that was a hole we had to definitely fix in our training. So making sure that they know the proper procedures and can have access to help improve any training. Record keeping and program evaluation. So that would be work-related injuries and illnesses like OSHA 300 form, keeping track of those, workers' comp records, and even records of different trainings that you've hosted. And also after you instill maybe a certain program, evaluating it for its success and making sure that it has improved upon past processes. It's also important to consider your insurance needs. Employers should consult with their general liability and workers' compensation insurance providers to ensure adequate coverage. There's also knowing the warning signs. They say employees typically do not just snap, but they display indicators of violent behavior over time. If you can recognize these behaviors, maybe you can manage them and maybe they can be treated. So some of those potential indicators could be an increased use of alcohol or illegal drugs, depression or withdrawal, resistance or an overreaction to policy changes and procedures, repeated violation of company policies and procedures, increased mood swings, explosive outbursts of anger or rage without provocation, suicidal comments about putting things in order, behavior which is the suspect of paranoia, like everyone is against me, increased talks of problems at home, talks of previous incidents of violence, or empathy with individuals committing violence are just a handful of some of the warning signs. Also recognizing those risky situations. Most obvious example I can think of would be terminations. So there's different protocols you can put in place. Like, do you want to have a legal or security staff present? Taking all threats seriously during these discussions, avoiding embarrassing the employee, and making sure that the employee can get home safely, and alerting the front desk if you are about to go through one of those processes. Another one is intoxicated individuals. The way we kind of work through these situations, and it's definitely, of course, case by case and proper training, but if it were a bigger male customer who had maybe been overserved or was giving off intoxicated warning signs, typically we sent me over if possible to help diffuse the situation. We figured maybe I was less intimidating and could maybe handle that situation with a little bit more ease. So there was not that instant guard is up, I can talk softly type of thing. So that was just one way we kind of tried to combat that. Again, case by case, proper training is definitely needed, but it was just something we tried. And if it were, a group of maybe younger females, maybe we sent a different one. It's using the environment and what works best for you. And another prevention strategy is just encouraging reporting. Employee reports of suspicious or threatening behavior are critical to effective violence prevention programs. Your workers need to know that they have the confidence that their reports will be taken seriously, confidential, and that the appropriate action will be taken to encourage continual reporting and being able to identify those risks. You could even set up a hotline where employees can anonymously report concerns. And there's definitely no such thing as over-reporting. That was a very quick summary of some of the considerations that should be considered when trying to prepare your business. We could probably use an entire hour discussing this topic and still only skim the surface, but there are endless resources for businesses from organizations like OSHA and SHRM for more detailed procedures, toolkits, and response plans for specific workplace scenarios. Definitely no such thing as over preparation, especially when considering something like this. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of our team if you need help finding any of those resources. And that wraps it up for Amanda and I. Elizabeth, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, guys. We always appreciate your insight, and I'm thrilled to hear this month there was so many submissions for topics. We do always encourage you, if there is something that your organization is struggling with, to please share that either with the girls at Ironwood or email myself. We'd be happy to put those topics on our itinerary, because what we found is if one client's struggling with a topic, usually multiple clients are struggling with that same topic. And we just don't want you to ever be afraid to ask for help or ask for guidance, because that's what we're here for. And just a reminder, I know life is busy and your list is long, but if you haven't taken an opportunity yet, we are making progress with getting everyone transitioned over. But if you haven't had an opportunity yet to complete that paperwork, it's super simple, a one-page document. I will include that in the follow-up, or this follow-up email I'm going to be sending out with the recording. But please do take a second to do that. It takes 5 minutes, and it's so much easier when that agreement is already in place prior to a crisis happening. So I do appreciate you all taking time to tune in to our Clear Up the Chaos. Our next Clear Up the Chaos is taking place Tuesday, July 12th, and we should all be live then. So I look forward to it. And if you do have any travel plans scheduled, wishing you safe and happy summer. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye.